welcome everybody to the audience. And I know this is, again, by the crowd that we have here, I think you are extremely passionate individuals about, sustainability. So we are very, very happy to see this group here today. So I just wanted to kind of kick off because this is a massive, massive topic and something that we feel very, very passionate about as a team. And I think it's also something that's incredibly important to the hospitality industry. If we look at data-driven results and benchmarking and the requirements of why it's so important to have different certifications in place, there's that nasty term that floats around called greenwashing. And this is something that first came about in 1986, and it was actually aimed at our industry, at the hotel industry, by an activist and environmentalist who was challenging hotels' suggestion to reuse towels. And so this is how that term was coined. And I thought that was interesting because we as an industry within hospitality, this is one of the reasons that we should be at the forefront of actually leading the change of what's happening in the sustainable nature. We also see that our consumers and our guests that are staying in the hotels, this is something that's increasingly popular within the communities. Even as late as last year in 2021, Booking.com actually added the sustainable filter within their OTA platform so that people, because this is a response to consumer demand. And I'm really curious, Xander, because you are really at the forefront of this. This is something that you've been very passionate about for many, many years. You've done this as a developer. You've done it as an operator. You wear lots of hats.
Yeah.
And you did this very successfully, achieving a LEED Platinum certification on your hotel, which is incredible. So well done for you. But I really wanted to chat and get your experience, especially for the audience, for those owners, operators that are in the audience. What was your experience with when you developed your hotel, and what did you do in terms of ESG when you were thinking about this at the inception?
Very good question. Thank you for having me. I started this process 14 years ago, not coming from the industry, and I said I want to have the most sustainable, innovative hotel. And I happen to be the owner of the operations and the property. It was quite a challenge to find the definition together, to find a dot on the wall where to go to, because operators and developers are not always on one line. So I had to think of really a manifesto to go forwards, which was in the end Treating Life Well, which is like 4 perspectives. And the challenge was that people were very much in silos. And I'm convinced 14 years later that really changed, that we have the same perspective as the incentive at the end of the development, after the development, so the operators.
I mean, you really started this, 14 years ago. You were really much on the cutting edge of where this was going, and now we see that trend. Ufi, I know that when we've been chatting about the projects globally, there is a trend where this is where this is where our industry is going. This is where the business is going. This is where the consumers want to go. And, I think this is, for the audience and for a lot of people, it's trying to understand what is that trend and why. Why is it not just the right thing to do? That there's actually business behind it, that there is, a sustainable investment behind this. But I'm actually curious, how that kind of parlays into the regulation piece, Ufi, because right now, Xander did this as an entrepreneur. He did this, out of his own fruition, and really focused on trying to figure out what was the right thing to do and the best thing to do, but not only as a global citizen, but as a businessman.
Exactly.
As a developer, as an operator at the time, and seeing what actually made the most sense for you.
Well, I'm convinced that like the team and the stakeholders at the beginning, and you can call it the green team or whatever, if you say what's in it for me, it's also, I'm an entrepreneur, it's like, it's also the investment or the return of investment. So it really makes sense if you try to look over the 4 years of average governments or developers look, that it's going to be viable in the longer future. And if you have a structure who last longer than 4 years, it's a good idea to look further than just the 4 years.
And most of the most of the investors and the investment audience that we'd be talking to within the hotel investment community are looking for usually a mid to longer term yield on their returns. So this is something that would most certainly benefit them.
Yeah.
So this is, and I think that's a very interesting point because again, you had the benefit of wearing both hats and making those decisions on the development side that would affect the operations.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, we have a separation between those parties, and this is something that I think that Shamir, we had also talked about as well with you and Ufi as well of what can we do. Because we have those separate parties, because we have operators and developers, what is some of the ideas that we have that how these parties can work closer together?
I'm happy to start. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of regulation, it's very important to point out that we're sitting here in the Middle East, and arguably the Middle East has come to the party later than some other regions. Europe, I think it's fair to say, in terms of regulation, is leading the way. So the European Union, EU taxonomy, SFDR has completely shifted capital markets in Europe, which has therefore had an impact on global capital markets. So big institutional capital, those who are in private equity, those who are in debt capital, so big international banks, global banks, are putting pressure on those who run their portfolios of assets to say, prove to me that your asset is not going to be stranded within a short period of time. Prove to me that your asset will sustain its value in 5 years, in 10 years, and it's not going to be classified as stranded because it will no longer be, it will no longer be compliant with environmental regulation. And that pressure is trickling down. So that draws us to the fact to say, okay, well, how do we define a sustainable hotel? What is a net zero carbon hotel? What are the definitions that we're all working to? Are there even any global standards that we're working to? Those global standards for our industry do not exist. So there is no way to tell whether any of the projects or any of the wonderful things that we've seen on the screen are good or good enough. So it is absolutely critical in order to manage and mitigate investor risk, to mitigate compliance risk, to ensure that our assets actually sustain value and grow value in the longer time frame, that we set the definitions and we set the benchmark so we know what we're all working towards. Otherwise, how can we do anything without knowing if we're doing, as I said, anything good or good enough? And that's why our partnership with BRIAM is so important, and that's why our coalition of investors and developers who've actually done it, like Xander, is so important. So we're very, very pleased that we're working with BRIAM because we have a mantra which is your metrics must be scientifically robust and they must be commercially viable. If they're not either, then they shouldn't be considered to be a metric. And that's why we're very pleased to be working with BRIAM because they are the world's leading sustainability accreditation system when it comes to scientific, evidence-based benchmarking.
And that's a great point because that's really where we as an industry, not just the hotel industry, but as a global community are trying to go is the measurables. What is the qualitative and quantitative analysis that's going behind this instead of just basically really putting our money where our mouth is. And I think that's something that BRIAM has been focused on for the last 30 years, which is incredible. BRIAM has been at the leading forefront of this. There are also wonderful organizations who are looking at this, but BRIAM is really taking the forefront in some of the data analysis and how it's also adaptable. And Shamir, I just wanted to chat a little bit to you about what are those differences and as Ufi said, how you guys are looking at, classifying an asset. How does that work geographically? How does that work from the scientific? Do we adapt for different countries, or if you could give us some insight on that, because I think it would be really interesting.
Yes, absolutely, and it's wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I think it's first off just important to identify, as you probably did there, that BRIAM was the first sustainability rating scheme anywhere in the world. 32 years ago there was nothing there. It created this entire movement for change, and I think that's really apt in terms of what we're here and promoting, and recognizing the partnership that we've got with the EEA as well. In all that 32 years, we've certified over 600,000 assets around the world in over 93 countries, and have got 2.3 million buildings registered to the program. But actually, it's not enough. If we're genuinely going to make enough of a change in the built environment, and often I talk about the stats in terms of the trajectory and ambitions to get to net zero by 2050, by the time we get to that point, 80% of the buildings that will be there in 2050 are here today, assets like this and many, many others. So how do we start to really mobilize and translate what the certification process means to existing buildings, and in this context, existing hotels? And that's why our alliance, together with the EA, with people like Xander and others, is so critical, because actually, by being involved as a member of the EA, you can be involved in the process, just as you're describing there, Morgan, that actually how we've adapted BREEAM around the world is because we do adapt and recognize that in all different countries within which we operate, we've got to recognize there are commonalities in terms of metrics, taking a whole life performance approach to what we do, but also picking out the differences in terms of legislation, regulation around waste, management, transport, whatever these issues are. We've got to be able to localize them. And actually, by taking such a uniform view across the BREEAM sort of ecosystem, if you will, that gives many investors, banks, financiers, and others confidence that actually the underlying mechanism is robust, science-based, and continuously evolves. So I think it's absolutely right that you pick out the fact that we have adapted the scheme for different asset types. We want to really focus on the hotel sector. We think there's a huge opportunity, and also there's a huge proportion of the marketplace now where you clearly see the benefit. That's why there's so many people here. You know, we don't have to convince you that it needs to be done. I think you're here because we know it has to be done, and this is the how we are going to go about doing it.
That's fantastic, and it's again something music to all of us, you know, who are in the hospitality industry, that we are looking at, you know, different certifications and requirements specific for hotels, trying to understand how we can implement that on our day-to-day measures. And I just find this absolutely fascinating, because Xander's obviously had the experience of doing it firsthand, you know, ahead of the curve, yeah. And had the kind of the first jump on that. But this is a constantly evolving platform. This is a constantly evolving process, and the adaptability that you guys are working in with BREEAM at the moment, I think, is incredible. But how does it work with, you know, getting the feedback for the hospitality industry? Do you have operators that are involved, brands that are involved, and, you know, investors, and you've got members like Xander, who I think have been a key contributor to some of these things? How does it work?
Well, I think that it's fair to say that the change is being driven by the investment community. That's a fact. It's the owners who have the liability by government, by law, to actually deliver on environmental, social, and governance issues. They are liable, and therefore they're the ones who are driving the change. I think it's fair to say that perhaps the brands and brand standards will probably come later. In fact, unfortunately, there are some cases where brand standards can be a hindrance to the investments that owners and operators want to make. So our community does represent everyone in that mix. We are very heavily investment focused. We represent the asset owners and the asset managers and the investors. Companies like Brookfield, Invesco, you know, those big institutional capitals that own big portfolios of assets, but also smaller developer and owners like Xander. But we also have brands who are at the table and who are working with us, because while the ownership and investment side is leading the change, the others may be followers, but it's important that we have everyone on the same page. And collaboration is key, so we're all about collaboration, and we're trying to bring that whole community together. And picking up on Xander's point about this being global, we're very keen that these standards are aligned with the international financial reporting standards. So we're working in alignment with IFRS. We're working in alignment with SASB, which is the big global accounting standards. So the technical standards of the global reporting standards will be aligned. That is our ambition. And that therefore ties in the capital markets and the debt capital, which is why we have so many banks and others who are working with us to this extent. So to be honest, it's really the money driving the change.
The money's driving the change.
Absolutely.
And, I think it's probably a very fair point. Now, Xander, I know that you had this experience as well with when you were developing your hotel. Challenging the status quo, challenging the requirements, and did you feel that you were at the the ownership level, you were pushing that boundary, and would you encourage others who are developing to push those boundaries to make sure that we are, as owners, pushing this agenda forward?
Yeah, exactly. I was very, very much surprised and enthusiastic about the kids of yesterday, and I was in the same situation. So I didn't come from the industry, and I asked them, why are the brand standards? Please explain me why the brand standards are. And usually they don't ask that to whether it's an operator or an engineer. And if you ask the question, together you start thinking about, is a 4-piece bathroom, or is your water uses, whatever a part of the process you take, you start redesigning or rethinking about developing a hotel. Also in the financial part, that you want to basically, does it make sense? Does the old brand standards make sense? And for me, it was because I had a sort of a white canvas. I could say I don't have to think out of the box because I've never been in the box. So please explain me as expert, whether you're an engineer or a big brand or a constructor or even a banker or financer or an operator, please explain it to me. And then usually they come with a book that, well, it's written here, whether it's the metrics of the lighting or the ventilation, etc., etc. So getting in the middle, in the end, I was the owner. And I was responsible. And the other people are trying to get a piece of that. They say, no, I'm the owner. I say, okay, if you're the owner, then you're going to be responsible for this process.
Well, this, I think between I think that the message that I get there is challenge the status quo. And as these things are developing, the money is kind of driving the change, and we'll set the regulations and we'll set the standards. But we have to continuously, as a community, question and push those things together. Now, I am. There was something that I really wanted to chat about as well, which was the partnership between BREEAM and EEA. You guys are looking at actually taking all those elements previously from different hotel or different asset classes, and how to tailor that specifically for the hotel industry. And I want to quote this. It's going to be, you'll be co-creating the first global scientifically robust standard for sustainable building management in the hospitality industry, known as the BREEAM in use for hospitality industry. That was a mouthful if our title of our panel wasn't. So just a few questions about this. When is this going to be rolled out? Because this is going to be something that will be key to our industry at large.
Absolutely. And I think it's really such an important thing for us to be doing together, is that BREEAM's been operating around the world, different asset types, different classes. But actually, this is the first time that we've formed such a partnership with industry, really, to be involved in the process, to be able to genuinely co-creating it. Because when people talk about tailoring an existing system like BREEAM for the hotel sector, a big part of the working group that members of the EEA are actively involved with, my technical team in BREEAM, it's already started. And we've got some road to go ahead. But actually, it's continuously evolving, because some of this might be about language, about what we call certain things in certain types of buildings, might just not even resonate to people in the hospitality sector. We can't be that naive. We've got to really engage and understand, are we talking about the same things? Do we mean the same things? How can we make sure we're continuously focusing on the right outcomes that we've got to be able to deliver against? Are we talking about metrics in the same kind of way? Yes, there's nuances to hotels. How are we categorizing hotels? And it's been a fascinating learning journey for us, technically, to listen and hear feedback from Xander and from other members of the EEA who are telling us, well, actually, we don't talk about it like that. We define these things like this. And you're like, wow, that's fascinating. So some of it was about learning how we have to make the system accessible to the members of the EEA. Some, wonderfully, have already started the process and going through the certification system already. Others will get more involved, and others will take part as time goes on. So it's going to be continuously evolving as the science updates, requirements change. If you just mentioned, alignment to taxonomies, reporting frameworks, and all these systems, because actually the data is yours. For those of you in got your assets yourselves. The data for your buildings and your properties, your hotels, it's yours. Let's utilize it and give it that multiplicity of uses that it has. We don't need to create systems whereby you're putting data into one thing to get one outcome. Put the same data in a different format into something else to get a report out of it. To talk about sustainability reporting, requirements around reporting to governments, to financial institutions. Actually, the core aspect, which is so important to what the change that we're driving, is actually to enable that to happen through the system and the work that we're doing together with the members of the EEA. Ufi, I'm sure you want to add to that.
No, absolutely. I mean, some would question, okay, why is the EEA working with BREEAM and not LEED? Right? So, I mean, it's a...
Did you just ask that? We're doing
I
that now.
asked that.
Okay.
I asked that. I'm sorry,
You're good.
Shamir. It's true, but, you know, we're asked these questions all the time. And we keep coming back to a number of things. One, it's got to be absolutely robust. It's got to be independently assessed. This thing about, you know, not... I mean, unfortunately, up to this point in time, the majority of the reporting in our industry around sustainability is about marking your own homework. You know, we can't get away with that in schools, but we expect to get away with that in global markets. And that's changing rapidly. The global capital markets are not accepting self-verification. You know, there are reports, 235-page long sustainability reports that people keep sending me. Oh, have you seen this one? Have you seen this one? If you read this one, so-and-so's just published this one, and I read it, and you know, it shows that we have a very big opportunity for change. So the robustness that BREEAM brings, the fact that they have over 600,000 assets already in the EU system, over 2 million assets worldwide who are part of their group, huge learnings for us from other sectors of real estate, a lot of learnings that we can, and we are leading the change, as he's just said, in terms of real estate, so a lot that we will also share back with the rest of the real estate community. A lot from new build, a lot from existing assets. And as Shamir keeps reminding me, in 2050, 80% of the building stock that will be here when we're all supposed to be in a globally net zero carbon economy, 80% of that building stock is already here. We have to focus on transitioning our existing stock. It's not just about new design and new build. What about our existing assets? That brings us to operational management. That brings us to the management of the asset performance of existing assets. And that's why we chose to work with BREEAM, because by far they are superior to everyone else in the world when it comes to the existing built environment.
And so from what you're seeing from the global markets and the trends, though, but you know where the capital's coming from, this is going to be a requirement. So it's already a requirement in some jurisdictions, and it's going to be a growing requirement, you know, throughout the world.
Absolutely. You know, investment companies like, I'm sure they wouldn't mind me quoting them, some of our members, Invesco, Brookfield, you know, these big institutional capital organizations who own mass portfolios of assets, they are getting pressure from above, and they are looking down into their portfolios, and they're asking 3 questions of their portfolios. Number one, at which point will this asset become stranded in accordance with the European Union's CREM pathways? Because there is already a pathway that investors are using to show at which point the asset's going to become stranded. A hotel was just opened recently, I'm not going to say where, in a major capital city in Europe, and it's shocking to us to know that the asset's going to be brand new build, it's going to be stranded in just 3 years. That's not acceptable for the asset community because the value is going to fall significantly. And then working backwards from that, okay, if we know at which point it becomes stranded, what do we do to ensure that it doesn't become stranded within 5, 10 years, but it's actually got the longevity of the value of the asset, the return on my investment is going to be sustained. And the third thing is then, okay, knowing how much it's going to cost. Where's the capital intervention going to go to be able to make that sustainable for me? So all these are the questions that the capital markets and the valuers are asking. So, you know, bringing them together to help to design those standards that we're going to be assessed by globally feeds into assigning the valuations for those assets as well. So our capital markets committee, for example, led by JLL, is doing a huge amount of work with many of the banks and institutional capital providers to work out, okay, these are the technical standards. What about how we value those, how we assign values to those metrics? So a lot of work is going on at the moment in terms of the valuation of those metrics as well as the technical standards, as well as other aspects like social impact, as well as, which also feeds into the valuations as well. So a lot of work going on in that community.
So how would one actually start this process? I mean, it does sound cumbersome. You know, it sounds scary. It's daunting. You know, you start talking about all of the regulations that are going to be coming in place and how that trickle-down effect through through the portfolio of hotels. Yep. What can asset managers, investors, where do they start? I mean, this is it can be a very confusing process. So what is the advice and what's the best way and the pathway for them?
I think to maybe just kick it off, and I'm sure if you will follow on, is that historically, whether you're going for BREEAM or other schemes are available out there, certifications, it's quite linear. You make a decision to start something, and then you're engaged in a process, and then you want to finish it to get your rating or whatever it might be. And one of the key unique things that we're doing with the EEA now and the Alliance is very much around members take part. They're starting to engage with the system, and that's a key part of the first step, because to say, do I want to certify every building on planet Earth? No. Actually, we've got to recognize there's a huge spectrum of assets out there. As if you rightly pointed out, there's the existing stock is a huge spectrum. So how do we get more buildings into a wider ecosystem where they can share the data, understand their own impacts, so they can actually move towards a better understanding? You know, we've got, just to give you a sense of the scale of what's happening out there with big investors across Europe, the States that I look after as well, and a few other markets. 3-4 years ago, the team would be in an office, imagine that, 20, 30 buildings in a portfolio or a fund would come in and they'd be high-fiving each other, being super happy, it's great times, right? No one bats an eyelid with 30, 40 now. It's hundreds are coming in, 500, 600 at a time. That is the scale and the pace of change that we are seeing right now. And many of these people who have got funds behind some of these assets will probably have hotels. So actually now is a wonderful moment for us to be able to forge the relationship with the EEA, to then go forward to open it up to members, which I'm sure you'll talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's just Xander's done it, so I also deferred the question to him. It seems daunting. You have to start somewhere. For me, the feedback that we get from our members is, I have to start by knowing where I am. If I don't even know where I am today, how can I draw a line and say, okay, this is the point from which I need to move forward? So, you start by looking at your performance. You start by analyzing and assessing where you currently are. And what BREEAM has done is they have very generously opened that platform to our members to do exactly that. So our members are already being able to understand. They have the whole framework there, the sustainability framework. All the metrics are already there for real estate per se. So they can go in and analyze where they are and understand what needs to be done to move forward. That provides us with huge amounts of data. The data we can use to create weighted averages to define those metrics going forward. What is good? What is good in an upper-class hotel in terms of energy consumption per square meter, by kilowatt hour? We need to define these things, right? Because nobody knows what they are. So that data is helping us. And the intellectual capital by our members who are using the system and feeding back and saying, actually, this doesn't work for us, or why is this here? That metric doesn't really make sense. All of that, and I really applaud BREEAM for their openness and flexibility to say, we are going to take all of that feedback from the industry, work with the data, and create a very robust system specifically for hotels. And just one final thing, which is STR. STR also involved in our partnership. So our ambition is that our metrics are going to become as standard as ADR, occupancy, RevPAR, GoPAR. And we're working to make sure that all of those metrics are like for all asset classes according to STR's asset classifications. And that's been approved by our committee. So all of that is already happening in play, which is great.
I'm so impressed by this panel. The expertise that we have up here is immense. And I do want to encourage everyone, these esteemed panelists are actually going to be continuing a roundtable discussion at 4:30 p.m. In the Creativity Suite, on the Creativity stage from 4:30 to 5:30 for an up-close conversation. And I would urge the audience, because as Shamir and Ufi have just kind of explained, it does not have to be a daunting or unapproachable process. Xander is a member himself of the EEA. He's been doing this. He's a huge participant in it. So this is our opportunity for you to chat to a developer who has done this himself, who has gone through this process as an operator. He has seen firsthand what matters to the consumers, the guests, and as an owner from an investment strategy. Talking to Shamir and Ufi from an investment perspective, and also just the regulatory environment that you're going to be working in the future. This is incredibly valuable. In closing, if I had to ask you all one tip or one piece of advice that you would like to give the community at large of what should we be doing, what could we be doing in the future within the hotel industry? What is the best way to start? What would your recommendations be to the owners and the operators in the audience, Xander?
Well, basically 14 years later, I wish the platform of the EA would have been 14 years ago. So 14 years ago, I had to explain on the stage why. That stage is past, and I'm very, very keen and happy that after 14 years, a platform like that, with all the owners, can give their input in it instead of they make the legislation, so you're involved in it. So it's not the future of the hospitality, it's the now of the hospitality, and it's the momentum. So
get involved in the EEA, is what you're saying.
Well, it doesn't have to be the EEA, but let's do it together. Okay. Let's do it together, and it's very fair to say what's in it for me. So whether it's financial or saving the globe for the next generation, doesn't really matter as long as you do it on the same panel.
Fantastic. And Shamir?
I'd say it's really about making that first step. As you mentioned rightly, for some and many, it seems to be quite daunting that actually whatever mechanism, clearly we would promote, become a member of the EA, but it's so essential that you start that process, because whatever that is, the momentum will build, you will learn, and I think a big part of this whole agenda for me is around the literacy, the understanding, the knowledge that we will begin to grow, and no one's perfect. I get stuff wrong all the time, but actually how we build and grow and learn, I think, is fundamental to it, so don't let anything put you off. Today, when you finish today, or go back to wherever you are around the world, you can start today and actually learn from that process as well.
Fantastic. And Ufi?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the consumer is becoming increasingly unforgiving, and greenwashing is in the title. So one thing that they will not forgive is lack of transparency and greenwashing. They will forgive anyone for saying, look, this is where we are today, but we have a plan to go forward. So my single tip is find out where you are today. Assess where you are. Know where you are. Get the data. How can you run a business if you don't know what your performance is today? Once you understand that, then you can start planning forward. And that will make the whole process much less daunting, because you know where to start and where you're starting from. So if you think it's daunting at the starting point, that's because you don't have the information to make informed decisions. Once you get that information, and there are experts in the world, like Ibrahim, who can help you to get that information. After that, I'm confident you will find it's not so daunting anymore.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for the time and the expertise. And again, the panel will be available at 4:30 p.m. So please join us for the roundtable discussion. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Morgan.